Ravi Vasudevan is a professor emeritus at the Center for the Study of Developing Societies in Delhi, India, where he built the very influential Sarai program, a research program and training program for younger scholars, which is at the intersection of media studies, infrastructure studies, urban studies, and has really shaped the research agenda for film and media studies in India and beyond for the last 25 years. Ravi Vasudevan is a guest faculty at JNU, the Jawaharlal Nehru University in Delhi, at Jabalpur University in Kolkata, the other important film studies program in an Indian university, and at Ambedkar University, which has a focus on media and law, where Ravi, who works at the intersection of media history, film history, and politics and political theory, is also an important lecture. Tonight, we'll hear about the mythopoetics of populism in India, and without further ado, and to move things along quickly, I cede the podium to Ravi. Thank you for coming here. Thank you for giving us this lecture, and please take it.
Fine. Thank you very much, Vincent, for being a wonderful host at Frankfurt with the ConTrust program, and giving me the sense, which is very rare, that often one can move out of one's disciplinary boundaries and have conversations across the board, as I experienced last week when ConTrust and others hosted a workshop on soft power. There are very different disciplinary configurations there, and it really worked very interestingly and productively. Now, for this presentation, I was speaking directly or attempting to speak to ConTrust's main thematics around the presumption that trust is always predicated on a calibration of conflict. It is never superior to or abstractly removed from the sphere of conflict. It's always driven by some way of negotiating conflicts as they emerge and evolve. And I'm looking at the situation primarily in India today, but I would expect there are resonances elsewhere about the way in which an authoritarian populism manages to secure some level of trust in fairly substantial swathes of the population, despite a very authoritarian disposition and clamp down on, say, civil liberties or freedom of speech, etc., etc. You nevertheless have this kind of investment apparently in this figure who has had a certain already now in his second term, Narendra Modi. What are the conditionalities? What are the circumstances which foster or enable this kind of a sense of trust or investment? Let us put it as investment as well. And this is the main thrust of this, which I'll be looking at. And I started with a particular set of images. And these images relate to how authentic is a leader's feeling for the public or the populations which he actually responds to in a situation of crisis. So here is one such image. India was in the depths of the terrifying pandemic of the summer of 2021, and we had actually an incapacity both to handle patients but also to handle bodies in the standard sphere of where a desirable death can take place. According to ritual procedures and cremation, bodies were floating down the Ganga. And it is in this context that there's an expectation that the leader should be able to respond to this situation. And belatedly, perhaps, and belatedness is also a quality of a particular form of management, I think. Belatedly, the leader actually does respond. But there's a lot of querying of the belief of the authenticity of the performance. Is this a performance? Are there genuinely tears welling up? Is it the situation as the country experienced? There was another one a few months before this, and this seemed to be an involuntary rush of tears. If this was a peasant leader who was actually kind of being seriously kind of patrolled and repressed by the police of Delhi, and he just burst out. So there are these counterpoints within a kind of emotional field as to what is legitimate, what is authentic, what genuinely kind of articulates feeling, and what is actually a performance, and perhaps not a very good performance. This is a question which actually has been raised in the sphere of melodrama studies, more generally, an area I'm particularly interested in, and I sometimes would like to persuade others that even in political science or political theory and other theories of fields of exploration, melodrama may have a potentiality in terms of actually trying to explore the conditions under which certain modes of address, certain ways of actually engaging populations and publics, and the ways and the expectations of the performance would actually be, could be productively explored. So one of the issues I'm posing here is the question of authenticity. The second one is the question of how, despite the inefficacy, say, of the political icon to express adequately the sentiment which is expected of him, why is there a continued reposing of faith or belief? Or is it so? Just because he's elected recurrently, does it mean that this is actually trust? Or is there some other vector of investment which is actually taking place? And what is that about? And these are two frames. I've already signaled melodrama, but let me talk about the mythopolitical first. And here I'm actually drawing upon a certain new trajectory within post-colonial theory, which is looking to longer lineages, genealogies of institutions, practices, imaginations, which go well before the colonial period. And there's been an exploration of classical texts and forms and modes to think about how exactly, say, in this particular case, the political is being framed. And where spheres such as the sacred and the otherworldly and the world of gods, what relationship does that world have with the world of walking, working mortals? And the kind of forms of secular power which frame that kind of existence. What is the relationship between kings and gods and ordinary people? And how does mythopolitics continuously kind of map this as a significant frame with which to understand things? So it's maybe something which you've learned about from the classical epics, you know, the Mahabharata or something like that. But it's something which you have intuitively internalized. It becomes part of you, and it becomes a particular pitch or mode of address, which becomes significant. I'm not going to great detail here, but obviously the mythopolitical is not archaic in itself. It is continuously remodeled in terms of the forms of technology, the ways in which something circulates, the types of the modern forms, for example, of media, and how these actually kind of calibrate sensory experience in relationship to particular objects. So this is not something to say this is archaic and it has a continued persistence or claim on imaginations. It is under modification, and it's interesting to see how technologies, especially media technologies, facilitate a certain mode of address, engagement, sensory grip. And this is one of the areas which historians of various sorts and cultural theorists have addressed the problem. One of the significant formulations is by the cultural theorist, Ashish Nandi, who is by training a clinical psychologist, who argued that, in fact, most of the world is not governed by modern forms of historical thinking. In fact, they are driven, they're held within a different matrix and a different set of ways of understanding the past. And we must attend to that difference, not impose the logics of modern disciplinary history in trying to understand how to position the imagination of large populations and publics. This is in History's Forgotten Doubles. The art historian come anthropologist, Christopher Pinney, has actually built a substantial archive of chromolithographs, block printed visual imagery, which widely circulates as calendar art and in other forms, and has built an argument that if you trace the types of imagery involved in these print practices, you will see genealogies of the present and the secular being actually kind of framed in relationship to all sorts of religious and legendary iconography. So Nehru or Gandhi would still be framed through other ways, not just in terms of the life world and life stories which they inhabited in their time. So we would have that resonance. Not only, Pini said, would they have a question of a different type of narrative and way of knowing and understanding the world, but there would be a different sensory engagement. So that rather than the perspectival forms of art, which we are conditioned to know and learn from the West, and which was actually cultivated within colonial art academies in India, rather than the perspectival form, he argued for a kind of corpothetics, where he suggested actually a more dispersed field of experience, of impression and sense impression is calibrated through, for example, calendar art and the forms of color which are used. There's the mythological film. And it would be interesting, I think, sometimes to speculate. The mythological film is often seen to be India's founding genre in terms of popular cinema. It is the stories from the Mahabharata, the Ramayana, the great epics, and retailed in multiple ways, with some particular stories acquiring a presence, a persistence of popularity, certain figures also doing so. So that is the mythological film has been an element of great persistence from the cinema's origins. So this becomes another space within which there's a retailing of a certain type of legendary and mythic engagement, which moves us between the world of gods and the world of men and the world of kings. And that persistence is also something to be remarked on and worked on. And much of this is signposting. There's not been adequate work to explore this. But this register is something I would like us to keep in mind as we're moving through. With melodrama, I want to specify one particular trope. The existing scholarship has established that it's very much 18th century form, 18th to 19th century form, which emerged in Europe. And the argument earlier, Europe and America, and the argument earlier was this was actually a form which was pitched at a level of emergence of new forms of experience, specifically in the face of the kind of breakup of feudal orders and the certitude of where you are located in the world, which would include a disestablishment of the sacred and an insistence on the fact that men and women make their lives in some way, but fundamentally fraught and incoherent. This was its challenge, this was its power. Often it would be backward looking, it would seek earlier securities and certitudes of rank, authority, and even submission in order to kind of relocate yourself in a world of uncertain paths and uncertain futures. Nevertheless, it is bound up with the modern. The significant field, which for me politically is significant here, apart from anything else, there are many things I think I'll talk about, but I'm just zoning in on one, is the figure of victimhood. Victimhood, suffering, and silence are classic tropes within melodrama, which dramatizes in some way the marginality of subjects, the marginality of the poor, the inability of the poor, or the kind of a peasant, a serf, a migrant who is unable to find a space within which their distress and their need and their right can be articulated. It becomes a classic trope within which the solicitation of feeling from audiences is built up. So that the dynamic of the constituent feature of victimhood is something I would like us to hold on to here. It can be duplicitous also. That is what is the extra challenge, which I will come back to. It is not certain. We are made to feel, but we are not always sure whether the feeling is accurate or whether we are not being manipulated. This also becomes the dimension of the melodramatic. But these are two tropes, just keeping the mythopolitical and the melodramatic as kind of key kind of frames within which to think about the actual competing logics of attachment, affection, trust, fear, which is the field which we want to explore here. Now, now I'm zoning in on India specifically. Now, one of the key things is the self-conscious mobilization of mythopolitical tropes by Modi, India's current prime minister. So what you'll have is that he enters parliament symbolically from the site of Hindu sacredness. And the pitch is, of course, to construct a Hindu majoritarian identity in the face of quite diverse and stratified and complex kind of structures of caste, subcaste, former untouchability. How do you consolidate a kind of political Hindu identity? This becomes key. The first thing you do, and you do many things, and I don't want to go into that here, is that you actually choose a site which is symbolically significant or adequate to the purposes of your coming into the political sphere. You choose Benares, which is the sacred site of Hinduism, and but also has another dimension. It is the site of appropriate death, a death which is appropriate. You go to Benares to bury your dead, to cremate your dead, with their adequate ritual form, which is appropriate to your situation. So it has this dimension as well. In 2019, and we'll come back to this, the ghats, the cremation grounds where the burning takes place, are overseen by a particular formally untouchable caste. Under the Constitution of India, untouchability is absolutely abolished, 1947, 1950. Although the residue and the powerful continuing significance of former untouchable, now called Dalit, is a field of contests and all sorts of violent kind of issues and challenges. Modi has, amongst his proposers for candidacy in 2019, his second term, he has the Dome Raja. The Dome is the caste which oversees the cremation of bodies at Benares Ghats. Okay, so you are mobilizing the king of domes, the Dome Raja, to be your proposer. There's not only a compact with the city of Benares as the fount of sacredness, but you're also with the city of Benares as the fount of the realm of death, an appropriate death. So this is another term which we'll develop now over the course of the talk, is necropolitics. Because the forms of rule which are undertaken, and this is not specific to Modi, but the actual parameters of life in death, the management of death, and a necropolitics which determines who may live, who must die, are critical to this architecture, a symbolic architecture mobilizing all these different tropes and actually kind of securing it with the proposal by the Dome Raja of that time. We will move further into this as we continue, but I just want you to mark this. So the third term, which perhaps should be in signal, but how many terms will you have in a title, is necropolitics, is another field. Okay. I'm not going into, so I've already said this to you, okay. One of the things which I, as a film scholar, am interested in pursuing is to consider a longer history of what death signifies and how death acquires symbolic significance in the cinema. What are can we build a curation of such kinds of instances, and what kind of political valence, what political effect would such an archaeology offer? I'm only going to zero. There are many instances of this. The mass funeral, I think, across the board, was a significant instance of mass mobilization. Specifically, in the Indian context, it became mediated through cinema, and cinematic circulation of what was then called the topical film becomes quite critical to the way in which it's not just congregation at a site, but the actual ability to move the image of the death of Tilak or Gandhi or Nehru into mass audiences. There would be a shift in the spectrum of technological effect in the 1980s, so that when Indira Gandhi was assassinated in 1984, it was national television. At that time, there was only one national television, became the stage, if you want, in which there's a continuous mourning and crying at the site of Nehru Museum, where she was laid out in stage. At the almost kind of facilitating, if you want, an effective aura for the violence which was taking place in the city and many other sites against the community from which her assassins came, the Sikhs. So you have this mobilizational feature of all sorts, and you have to keep on tracking it. As we come into the contemporary, obviously, social media is another kind of key site for this. But I'm taking the exploration or excavation of mythic tropes, especially bringing a characteristic one, similar to Orpheus and Eurydice, is the Savitri Satyavama. You're bringing your husband back from the dead through a kind of through a negotiation with the god of the underworld. This is very is Hades, right? Hades in the Greek, and it is Yama in the case of Hindu mythological. This is another feature which does emerge from side to side, and sometimes is metaphorically addressed, not necessarily direct. But there would be many more. I'm only focusing on one, and which brings the thematics of melodrama, mythopolitics, and the imaginary of Benares and necropolitics together. This is the film, and I'm looking at two instances of this film. Often considered the first feature film made in the Indian film industry, a status which has been substantially debunked. But it's not so important as the fact that it is an important film made by a pioneer filmmaker called by the name D.G. Falke, and it is very much of a piece with a set both of mythopolitics but also of melodrama, and a specific form which is overlaps the question of renunciation. Let me very briefly tell you about this. One of the things about these movies is their powerful intertextual kind of existence, their circulation as plays, as kind of chapbooks, and as cinema, and into the contemporary. So you will still see scenes from Raja Harishchandra in Bhojpuri, one of the dialects of northern India, available on YouTube. So this persistence of a practice, and in fact, the persistence of particular scenes. No, it's not just necessarily the overall story, but particular scenes which evoke a certain type of audience engagement and interest. Now, very briefly, Harishchandra is also called Satyavadi Harishchandra, the truth-telling Harishchandra, a figure of such great, ethical existence, and a figure who was able to continuously aspire through sacrifice to a condition which almost brought him to the place of the heavens. He was almost at the portals of the heavens, eliciting considerable anxiety and upset by the ruling deities, saying that he must be challenged. And his challenge would be through not them directly, but by a sage, Vishwamitra, who would actually subject him to a series of tests. This is the originary scene where Raja Harishchandra has actually released, during the course of a hunt, arrows into what he thinks are women who have been imprisoned in front of the sage. They turn out to be figures of an otherworldly sort, which the sage, through his penance, has managed to arraign. He is furious that that Harishchandra has had the audacity to actually kind of interfere with his penance, and he demands a series of escalating kind of exactions, punishments, things which the Raja will lose in the process of compensating the sage for what he has suffered. This means the withdrawal from the kingdom. He leaves up his entire kingdom, this powerful king, and with him goes his wife and child. He is sold, because he has not done enough in terms of compensating the sage. He and his family has to sell themselves into slavery. And this takes place at Benares, at the market. The market becomes an important site, the court becomes an important site in this trajectory. There are many versions. So this is an instance from where Raja Harishchandra is made in 1913, this is made in 1932,
well-known
filmmaker. So here we have a husband, wife, and former king and child, son, who have been bought by a kind of rapacious kind of king, small zamindar, and they actually then, while she is sold to the feudal lord, he is sold to the dome. He becomes an assistant to the dome raja. He, the most powerful and mighty of kings, is now reduced to being he who will facilitate and help the dome in overseeing the cremation of bodies. So reduced has he been in the world. And the melodrama escalates. Nothing is enough. Vishwamitra stages the murder of a Benares prince and frames Taramati, the queen, with this. She is brought to the Ghats, and there, because he cannot pay the tax which you need to pay in order to burn the body, she is in turn kind of subject to, she has to give up her life, which only Harishchandra as the assistant can give. Here we have reached the kind of, the kind of nadir, if you want, of this story. At that moment, there's a divine, here are images of the Dome Raja in the 1932 film. And actually, Harishchandra does not look such a chaste figure, such a figure of who is brought down in the world on the right, if you notice. It's all to do with regional politics. This is the 1913 film where the Dome Raja is giving Harishchandra the sword, which he must kill Taramati with. And then there's divine intervention. This will resolve everything. This is now the limit. The test has been completed. Different configurations of deities come down. Shiva is key to this, to intervene and liberate and bring back to life people who are dead and to elevate them to the heavens. So this is a trajectory which you would say is mythopolitical. It is, if you want, an allegory, and has often been seen as an allegory about kingship and its decline, but also perhaps a colonial fable about the decline of kingship in the face of some superior power, even though this is not, of course, a cosmic power. It is the British company rule. And it is also seen as a particular way in which you can think what it means to resist the conditions of existence. So the historian and political theorist Prathama Banerjee has actually kind of excavated the terms of experimentation with self, which was characteristic in the 19th century and into the 20th century, in trying to actually build a relationship outside the realm of caste and the prohibitions of caste into a whole set of relationships which can pull you, make you not yourself, can make you empathize with the other, become part of this other world. Figures the Vivekanand and Mohandas Karamchand Gandhi as experimenters of this sort are highlighted in her analysis. But it is to do with some form of non-self. How do you create the register of a non-self in order to open yourself to the experience of the world? In fact, when I was looking at, there is another figure, both these figures. One is a figure of seeking non-self and identification with the wider frame. The other is the figure of real politics. This is now a very famous text called the Arthashastra, which is a text of governance, where the figure of Chanakya or Kautilya is considered a sage, aware, complex thinker of how to manage the world here and now in all its complexity. Both terrains have the parameters of death as an operational site. And the question of how to manage death and necropolitics is there in both. This first is to do with abjuring yourself of any material existence in some fashion. The second is to do with to know and to calibrate the material world well and to position people in the order of governance with coherence. But death becomes a kind of parameter for both of these kind of excavations, if you want. What does Satyavadi, the truth, the figure of truth, actually is not tested as a truth teller in the story. But he does do one thing. He is dutiful, and he actually, if you want, brings about through the register of his own experience, the truth of what it means to live and to die in the world, in a way which he as a king was not capable of doing, or it was not open for him to do. So it's a figure of renunciation, but it's also a figure of experience, where you're put into the actual kind of darker registers of bare life, literally, with which the world is actually dominantly organized. Now, I want to shift here by looking at a repurposing of the material of this first film and what it does. This is a film by an avant-garde filmmaker. His name is Kamal Swaroop, film made to commemorate the first film, that is Raja Harishchandra, in 2013, a centenary of celebration of the first film. And this commemoration is done by this director by tracking a kind of unrepresentative dimension of Phalke's life. He leaves the film industry, goes to Benares. For a period, he tries to be a theater writer, performer, and writer, which did not. It is a little known and not well. I mean, it's not considered a very significant part of his biography. But this is what Swaroop does. In the process, he takes the film, the 1913 film, and he shows it to audiences in Benares in 2013. It's as if there's a kind of peculiar conversation which is built up between that originary moment and the figure of Harishchandra and the contemporary, and is asking audiences to participate in a discussion about that. Not only does he actually kind of set up this conversation, he then uses the film as a kind of way into the city of Benares by actually mapping what the spaces and dimensions which are there in the film, which was set in a studio far away from Benares in 2013, what it meant when you actually kind of put that, take the film as a kind of, to the pro-filmic side, the places it wanted to be in 2013, actually bring it to those places and show specific figures. So quite critical is the river, quite critical is the markets, and most critical of all, of course, are the cremation grounds and the figure of the Dome Raja today, in 2013. Now you'll see certain convergences. That Dome Raja of 2013 is now shortly going to be the proposer of Narendra Modi and the kind of the configuration of necropolitics and contemporary politics in the city of Benares. But this exploration becomes, I think, suggestive. And I'm thinking of some of the work done, for example, by Catherine Russell on archivology, where you actually take found footage and older forms of footage and actually redeploy them or use them as the kind of way in to particular cities, events, etc., and build up a kind of conversation between the cinematic imaginary of yore and the contemporary kind of resonance and sites and spaces open up to the process of bringing these two things together. So here is a set of screenings. Here, in fact, is actually not a screening. It is actually just the projection of a photograph. This is a remnant of the theatrical troupe which Phalke put together in 1921. And there are several instances where he's actually looking at the fictive quality of sets and scenes in the city before he actually goes into the spaces of the city which have been already intimated by the pioneer film. Here, this is a theater which is now reduced to ruins, in which the play was actually kind of performed. And now you have the screenings which are taking place. So these are screenings of the film in celluloid amongst diverse audiences who do not particularly converse, but it's as if you're setting up a certain set of possible interactions. They're a bit puzzled by the speed of the film, the characteristic things audiences tend to be today. And then we move to the ghats, the cremation ghats, through the river, and to the Dome family. So here you, and of course, myth and the actual urban history come together, because the mythic figure Harishchandra has a ghat named after him, a cremation ground named after him. So these kind of convergences become suggestive and are marked. So this is the trip to the Harishchandra Ghat and a meeting with the domes and their own narrative of what evolved after the tribulations of Harishchandra came to an end, and how they themselves were transported to the heavens above. But the Dome Raja is an absent figure. His daughters refuse to say he's not at home, you cannot meet him, etc. And they're actually quite playful and quite dismissive of Kamal Swarup at that point. What we see at this time, and we come back full circle, is a more proliferated interest from 2014 in the figure of the Dome Raja. And sometimes they will appear as a figure who may be completely depleted. And now there are various accounts and very powerful historical and ethnographic analysis of the actual way death is actually managed in the city of Benares. Jonathan Parry has written a fabulous book some 30 years ago, showing that the dome is actually in a situation of contest. So things are not simple for him either. Where does he get his wood from? How is the wood market organized? What other priestly figures come in to try and intervene? So he's not as kind of dominant or significant a figure. His situation is continuously under contest. And here he seems an extremely modest entity. But the proposer is somewhat more generously kind of framed, you know, as a figure of life, of self-satisfaction. But Jagdish Chaudhary recounted a couple of years after he was proposer to Modi that unfortunately nothing had changed in his life at all, and his life situation had not improved at all. So that is the kind of downside of that smiling face, and he only died a couple of years ago after that. Now, I want to now come back, and this will be in the last passage. The question of trust and the configuration of the polity, which is being engendered through this kind of symbolic sphere, through the mythopolitical, and indeed through the melodramatic, through the figure of Modi. It is here that one needs to attend with greater care to some of the transformations which have emerged. One is a figure in a, and most of you, of course, may not know that much about it, but of course, the intricacy of caste and caste hierarchy in the Indian situation has been a very powerful frame in the actual way in which politics has been orchestrated. So in this case, we have a figure who self-professedly comes from what is called in constitutional terms, other backward castes. Figures who came primarily from the peasantry or artisanal classes and would have a better situation than former untouchables, but it's a complicated scenario. And they also are provisioned for in terms of affirmative action. These groups are also provided for in terms of affirmative action. So Modi projects himself as an OBC. Now, this is very important because what you're unsettling is two realms. You're unsettling a formerly dominant Brahmin, Kshatriya, high caste kind of political configuration, which ruled the country, not continuously, because there was a shift, especially from the late 80s, where there's actually access of these other backward caste groups and farming lobbies into power. But you have that the configuration shifting. I unsettled the kind of high caste hierarchies which have actually controlled politics in this country. And I do it on the side of Hindus. You know, Hinduism may be associated, for example, with Brahminism. But no, I, Modi, this figure who is not a Brahmin, enter this space and offer you something. What do I offer you? The possibility that, like me, you can be mobile. Figures from the OBCs, backward castes, can be mobile. And that becomes mobility, becomes a key vector of what this populism is, even if it is authoritarian. It is mobility under certain conditions. On conditions of don't speak up, do not dissent, do not kind of mobilize, do not do a lot of things, you know. But if you abide by the protocols of what this politics is about, then you may find your way advancing, at least within the polity and within political representation. So this becomes a key vector. You disestablish high caste hierarchies, you facilitate the appearance of a democratic mobility of a sort, and then you actually also control it with necropolitics. Now, this necropolitics is that this is the other scene. If you do not abide by this, then there's always the danger of a necropolitical devolution of what will happen to you. Now, necropolitics, I'm not just talking about in terms of death, and I think of killing. And I think Achille Mbembe, in his work on the subject, has actually kind of built a quite powerful set of dimensions to how the necropolitical works, which is how exactly death is meted out as life. That there is a forms of death. The death as a kind of horizon, nevertheless, actually facilitates depleted life. And the forms of depletion themselves become the challenge of survival. It can be protracted incarceration. That could be one logic. It could be also the diminution of livelihood. For example, the cow slaughter becomes a kind of anti-cow slaughter, and the actual pushing of the framing of the cow as a critical to the actual
Hindu religion.
And anyone who actually kind of attacks a cow, kills a cow, trades in cows, even is a tanner, would be actually beyond the pale. So this actually sets up a perimeter where it's about life, it's about livelihood and life, if you want. So one would have to go into greater detail as to how the necropolitical works in terms of framing a depleted life towards a bare life and incarcerated, So it's not a question of just one thing, death, but death is part of the design as well, right? So this becomes an important thing to think through. Mobility, the necropolitics as a field within which mobility is possible, but the significant challenge and disestablishment of hierarchies of yore by this. So it is a complicated kind of scenario which is being built here. And of course, there is the actual continuous mutation of personality for different audiences. I'm just gesturing to it now. This personality, the international statesman, has been around in the recent past at various G20 and but in 2019, when he had to take power to seek election once again, he withdrew to a cave in the Himalayas and actually kind of said, I'm not concerned with the outcome of what the elections would be. And he had the impression of a holy man, a rishi, but as many critics, and in fact, recent body of anthropological work have suggested, this is Modi in a slightly hectoring way. It's like Modi giving you a lesson, that in fact, this is Rajarshi, the sage king. It's as if you have brought into your body two figurations, both the figure of the sacred, the rishi, the holy man, but he who incorporates power into himself as well. There is no power outside himself. And it is this new form of the holy man who is actually now the be-all and end-all of the political universe. So, of course, now there's one thing I should say, and I will come towards a conclusion here. This is that, as Mbembe and many others say with populism, you have to constitute an enemy coherent. The enemy has to be coherent. Now, is the coherence of the enemy is even more important if the self is incoherent. If we are incoherent, that is the people who you want to kind of consolidate under one identity. It is paramount that you actually have clarity on who you are against, because you yourself may not be coherent. Now, this is not only to do with the various kind of sects and heterodoxies and things like that, which Hinduism is governed by, and also by the layers of castes. It is also to do with a particular form of governance, which is knowledgeable about this. So, in fact, a category which is fashioned, which we had not heard before, la bharti, which means beneficiary. So now, if you Modi and the BJP is continuously mapping to whom welfare should go. In fact, Mbembe has this very interesting formulation that a lot of what necropolitics deals with is actually fissiparous. It is split publics or driven publics which are not coherent. And in the modern epoch of polity, the distribution of weapons and all sorts of forms of authority, which is territorially distributed, there is a certain incoherence in the way in which the object becomes crucial because the subjects are diverse, dispersed, and empowered. Here you have a splintered public or set of publics, which you have to continuously manage. This is through, there are two levels. This one is, of course, the persona of the leader becomes a key kind of vehicle. And this is fairly traditional media. So you'll have bulletin boards and poster work ad nauseum through the cities of India, where this figure is towering above you, as the dispenser of some dimension of welfare to you. But the other side is that it cannot be this kind of aggrandized narrative alone. It is to do with these diverse and fissiparous publics which you are engaging with as potential beneficiaries. And it's here that a more distributed kind of media-driven logic of cell phone-based violence and circulation in social media against the enemy becomes very important. So the question of the lynch mob and the actual filmic capture of the lynch mob and its distribution becomes another vector. You have the great image, the grand spectacle of the leader, and then you have this diverse and dispersed field facilitated through social media of many acts of collusion, of being part of this bigger apparatus of creating the other, and in everydayness of form. So this is how, in a sense, there's the big picture and there are these dispersed pictures, but there's also this picture where necropolitics is not in control of death. Death exceeds it. It actually becomes, in a peculiar sense, eloquent. In a peculiar sense, it arrives on the world stage, as happened in May 2021, where I think the world was aghast at what was transpiring in India. It's as if the body, now in its very death, nevertheless had an agency in being able to communicate what its conditions of existence had been. I'll end on that. Thank you.